Now, he would do this deal later on with just a handful of brothers where he'd pull us in and just give us a cup of coffee and pour into us individually. And I can say that even in my crazy walk, as I progressed, he was one of those people that like, look, I know everybody thinks you're crazy, but I'm going to be your friend. And he
crazy.
really, that conversation really happened. And I'm just grateful for you, man of God. I just
love you, bro.
Love you, Rand.
Love you, man. Wow. Man, I'm so grateful to be here today. It's just awesome to see what God is doing here in your lives. And it's such an encouragement to be here with you because it just reminds me of where I came from. Bro, I just got wrecked in worship. I wasn't expecting it. You know, we were singing a song that said, Abba, I belong to you. And in my spirit was what I heard was, son, you belong to me. And that was a word that I needed to hear right now because I've been struggling the last couple of days because I've been believing certain lies about my identity, you know? And when I heard that in my spirit, it was just a reminder of my testimony because that's what my testimony is. It's a lost identity that Jesus restored. My dad was an alcoholic and an addict, super abusive to my mom. And so in the middle of the night, one night, we packed up and we left. And we moved to Dallas. And a couple years later, my mom remarried, amazing man of God. And he began to raise me. And to this day, I still call him dad, but there was one thing. His name's Luis Cristales. And we don't look the same. And so, yeah, so growing up, half of my family looked completely different than I did. My brother and my sister looked like my dad, my stepdad, and I didn't. And I remember wanting to have a relationship with my real father. And I didn't know why I couldn't, you know, and I had this amazing man of God that was in my life. But there was a voice in my head that said, that's not your real dad, you know. With that, we also moved around a lot. So every year, John touched on this morning, every year I was in a different place. And so that kind of furthered that whole identity crisis. And so I became a chameleon. Every time I moved, I was always the new kid. And so I wanted to fit in. And so to fit in, I would become whoever I needed to be to get you to like me, you know, and play that tape through middle school and into high school. I just didn't know who I was, you know, and so I was always trying to fit in. And one day I came home from school, it was my sophomore year, and my mom and my stepdad were sitting on the couch. I was like, this is weird. And they told me, hey, we're getting divorced. It was just out of left field, you know? And so that kind of reinforced the whole identity thing. Like, man, I'm not worthy of having a dad. I'm not worthy of having a family. And so my stepdad moved out. My brother and my sister moved with him. I stayed back with my mom. And that's around the time when I started experimenting with drugs and alcohol. I took a drink, really liked the way it made me feel. I started smoking weed. I really liked the way it made me feel. And I just remember thinking, I want to do this for the rest of my life. You know, I found my identity in drugs and alcohol. You know, I found my belonging, you know, my people. And eventually I dropped out of high school, moved out of my mom's house, and I went to Seattle. And my whole idea was, man, I'm going to reinvent myself. I'm going to become who I want to be. You know, I was going to create my own identity. And when I was up there, I mean, I just went crazy. I started selling drugs and, you know, all the stuff that comes with the street life. And really, I was trying to be somebody that I wasn't, you know, and I was really only fooling myself because I'm not hard, you know, I'm not a gangster. You know, I was playing one on TV. I started getting in trouble with the law though, you know, and I ended up getting a girl pregnant, and I disappeared. When she told me she was pregnant, I disappeared, and I went on this crazy cocaine binge because my drug use was progressing. You know, it wasn't just weed and alcohol anymore. Now I was doing heavier drugs. But then I came to the end of myself, and I realized, man, I'm bringing a life into this world. I need to get my act together. And so I moved back to Dallas. I got a job. I got an apartment. I flew her down. You know, I tried to set up a life for her. I had my son, but that relationship never, it just, there was no trust there. And by this time, I didn't want anything to do with God. I had family members that were Christians, and they would try to bring me to church services. They would try to pour into my life. I was like, I just don't believe that stuff, man. Jesus, like my whole idea of Jesus was like the blonde hair, blue eyed, what you see, growing up. And I didn't want anything to do with that. And I thought people who were believers were brainwashed. I was like, they're all crazy, But eventually, my circumstances kept getting worse and worse and worse. My girlfriend ended up leaving with the kid. And, that just reinforced that whole identity of being unworthy. Now it's like, man, I'm not even worthy enough to be a dad, And so the same stronghold that my dad had was passed on to me. And now my son has moved out of my life, and I can't stop using dope. I was addicted to pain pills. And then the pill mill started shutting down, and I graduated to heroin. And when I tried heroin, my life just went way down. I stopped showing up for work. Heroin became my God. I had some believing family members, my aunt and uncle, who always tried to pour into my life. And they told me, look, we know a place where you can go get some help. And they kind of hit me with the okie doke because they didn't know they were going to bring me to the Men of Nehemiah. And I showed up and I saw a bunch of guys wearing army fatigues. I was like, oh, wow, what is this? Okay. I was like, all right, well. Then, I realized, oh, it's a Christian organization. I was like, no, I'm not doing this. Then they told me it was 9 months. I was like, there's no way I'm doing this. And then they started singing in a choir. I was like, there is no way I'm doing this. No. Never sang a day in my life. And I remember the Monday morning I came into the classroom, and our founder in Dallas, his name's, we call him Colonel Lewis Harrell. I came up to him and I said, hey, look, man, my addiction's not that bad. I'm not really like these people. It didn't get that bad, right? And, in his wisdom, because he had been doing this for a while, he looked at me and he was like, you know what? I think you're right. He's like, what can I do to help you? I was like, I'm good. Thank you for everything you've done. I'll just get my stuff and I'll leave. And, in my mind, I thought I was never going to use again. And that night, I was in the trap house again, getting high. I got caught with some drugs. You know how we do. We try to middleman, get a little bit for ourselves. We're not really selling, but we're just trying to get a little bit for ourselves. Well, I got caught on my way to drop it off. And that was the first time I caught a felony. Went to jail for 6 months, got out on probation, and I still thought it was about my circumstances. Like, if I could just get my circumstances right, life will be better. And I ended up violating probation, and then I ended up going to prison. And I'm probably the first person in my family to go to prison. And I remember sitting in there, it wasn't a long term. I really just did a turnaround. It was like, daycare. But I remember sitting in there and talking to my family and being like, this is it. Like, I know what I need to do now. Like, this is it. It was a wake-up call. And they believed me. And so my mom let me parole out to her house. And in my mind, it was still the circumstances. So I got the job again. I got the car again. I got the apartment again. And I thought that if I had all those things together, and if I just tried really hard, that I could stay sober. Within a month, I was getting high again. And I remember that inner battle, that inner conflict, where I knew what I was going to do, and I knew I didn't want to do it, but I had no choice. And I ended up getting high, and my downward spiral was faster than ever. I was homeless on the streets of Pleasant Grove. I had been up for weeks. Yeah, I don't belong there. I was barefoot, I had no shoes on. I had my phone charger was my belt. I had my phone charger around my belt. I was hearing voices. I had track marks up and down my arm. I remember riding on the train, and I could hear the people behind me just talk about how bad I looked and how bad I smelled, and I didn't believe in God, but I remember praying to God, like, help me, And so I thought I didn't believe in God, but why am I praying to a God that I don't believe in? My uncle saw me walking down the street, and he picked me up, and he looked at me and he said, son, you're either going to have to get help or I'm going to bury you. And I knew that I could tell by the look in his eye, he was being serious. And I was so desperate. I was so broken. I was out of options. I had nowhere to go. And I was like, all right, I'll do it. And I knew he was going to take me to Mina Nehemiah. And when I got there, the voices started coming back again. Like, you don't need this. You're not that bad. Whatever. And so my plan was I was going to get a couple meals. I was going to get my strength back. And I was going to buy time to come up with a plan. But then something happened while I was there. I started listening to people teaching the word. And I had heard Bible teaching throughout my life, but something was different this time. It was ministering to my spirit. It was ministering to that wound I had inside of me about my identity. And I started to lean in. I used to sit in the back, and I started getting closer and closer and closer. And then eventually I was leaning in. And then one night it was a worship service, and I was like kind of looking around. Everyone had their hands up, and I was kind of looking like out the corner of my eye. I just kind of like barely like started raising my hand. And I decided to give myself over to worship. And in that moment, it wasn't an audible voice. It wasn't like anything spooky. It was more like this weight was lifted off my shoulders. And it was like all the evil, nasty, dirty things that I had done. I could just feel God's forgiveness. And I really leaned into that. And I gave my life to Christ. And a couple weeks after that, I got baptized. And I started submitting to instruction and counsel in my life. I started to grow in the knowledge of God. And then I started to bear fruit. And I graduated the program. And I thought that just because I got sober, I was going to get everything back. I thought just because I got sober that I would have a relationship with my son again. And so, if you've ever worked the 12 steps, in one of the steps you make amends. And so I tried to make amends with my kid's mom. And, I started rambling. I was like, I found God now. I did it totally how you're not supposed to do it. And I made it about me. And I got to the end of it, and she looked at me and she said, that's great. I don't care. And I was like, oh, man. And she was like, actually, we've been looking for you because I need you to sign these papers. We've been trying to get full. Now, in the time that I had been gone, it'd been years. It had been years. And she remarried, and they had kids, and they had a great family deal going on. And I wanted to make it about me. And so I went to court. And then, halfway through that court thing, I started to realize what I was doing. I was making it about me. I'm sober now. He was perfectly fine without me for 5 years, And so I did one of the hardest things I ever had to do, and I signed my rights over. And then I became bitter with God. So I had met Christ, I had gotten sober, and I became bitter with God because I was coming to God for what I could get from him instead of who he is. And when I became bitter with God, I started to see other guys in the program restored to their family. And I would cry, like, what's so wrong with me? It was the identity thing again. Like, what is so wrong with me that I can't have a relationship with my son? And he told me, just be consistent. Follow me, follow me, follow me. And so I made up my mind that I was going to do that. I was going to just stay consistent. It's not going to be in my time. It's not going to be in my time. I just need to follow the Lord. And then when he's ready, that time will come. And I know that in my heart, I always wanted a relationship with my dad, my real dad. He ended up passing away, and I couldn't, I didn't get that, but I always wanted it. And so I stayed consistent. God ended up blessing me with a beautiful wife. I've been married 3 years now. And she had, from her old life, she had 3 daughters, and so I get to be a stepdad. Last month, I celebrated 7 years sober. Yeah. But I still had this void right, from my son. And a couple weeks ago, yeah, it was one of those things where it's like, I'm grateful for all these things. I'm grateful that that I'm a son, and I'm grateful that Jesus saved my life. But there was still this, this longing to see my son. And the other night, I'm sitting on the couch, and it's like 10 o'clock at night. My phone goes off, and I look at it, and it's a notification on Instagram, and it was my son, man. It was my son. My son, and it's consistency. That's really what I want to tell you guys. It's not that you come through this program and you graduate and you get your plaque and everything's sunshine and rainbows. You might not be restored to your family immediately, but people can't argue with consistency. If you stay consistent in your walk, if you submit to instruction, if you submit to counsel, if you submit to authority, if you submit to the Bible, and you're obedient to the Word of God, doors are going to open. You have no option but to bear fruit. And it might not look like it's, in your timing, in your head, but God is faithful, and God is good, and God wants to see families restored. And so that's my testimony today. And I'm so grateful for you guys letting me share. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Thank you. So I get the privilege of introducing Pastor Dan Moeller. Man, it's been so cool just since yesterday getting to hang out with him and just seeing that he really is who he says he is. And he's poured into my life more than he knows just in a couple hours. And he's challenged some of those beliefs that I've been believing the last couple weeks. I first saw him preach a message. It was through YouTube about a year and a half ago. And I remember when I watched it, I was like, wow. That's refreshing, because he's calling, his message is calling you to become, right? It's calling you to become something. And man, I'm just so grateful to have you here, and I'm excited to hear what you're going to say. Come on up.